Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk a little bit about orientation for emergency communications volunteers. That could be an amateur operator. It could be a non-amateur operator. There's a lot of EmComm service provided by non-amateur people using gmrs or FRS. So you want a ham radio. Let's assume, and most of the people here I'm assuming are amateur radio operators. We're going to talk about pursuing emergency communications, but not only by amateur radio. But what do you want your radio for? You can use it for a lot of things: fun, family, community, and emergency communications. In the emergency communications arena, we've had an explosive growth, at least in our area in Western Washington, of new amateur operators. And the primary motivator for them to get their licenses to do some kind of emergency communications support. So we're going to be focusing on that. There's a lot of basic questions you're going to ask as you start looking at emergency communications. Basic questions would include: what radio should I buy? What training do I need to do emergency communications? Do I need a code kit? What should I have in my go kit? Who am I going to be talking to? Where will I be when I'm doing this? And a lot of other questions. So let's start out with: who are you going to be talking to, or who are you supporting? You're going to be doing emergency communications for someone. Right off the top, you've got government entities, and Seattle ACS supports the Seattle Office of Emergency Management. There's a picture of the Seattle EOC, and in the far back corner on the right side of this picture is the radio room that we have inside the Seattle EOC. That's our served agency. That's who we do. Typically, most EmComm for any type of a government entity is going to be to an emergency management office of some kind. You could serve non-government entities. Primarily, the Red Cross comes to mind. There's also a lot of corporate-sponsored emergency communications operations that you might participate in. Civic and religious groups, your church, your community group might be organizing to do this type of stuff. Family and neighborhood could be typical people who have emergency communications considerations. The next question is: who are you teaming with? To provide this, you're probably not going to be the Lone Ranger out there. You're going to be working with someone. Some of the most common groups that you run into that do emergency communications include ARES, Amateur Radio Emergency Service. That's organized under the ARRL. It's a national program. There are local emergency coordinators and teams, and the team is what you would join. Many ARES organizations or teams support some specific agency. There are others that don't support a specific agency but are available to be a resource if as called upon. You have RACES, Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Services. This is specifically applicable to teams who are supporting a government entity, because a government entity has to declare a civil defense emergency in order for RACES to come into effect. And they would then, prior to that, would have certified the RACES team that's supporting them. Auxiliary communication services have been around for about 10 or 15 years now. That's what Seattle is doing. We have a team of about 140 volunteers, and we exist to support the Seattle Office of Emergency Management and the City of Seattle. So ACS teams specifically exist to support someone, some entity or agency. Oftentimes, ACS teams are also RACES organizations, and we are, because we're supporting a government entity who has the capability of declaring the civil emergency, civil defense problem, so that they can activate their RACES team. Other possibilities include you're serving with a CERT team, Community Emergency Response Team, a club, or some other community group. So there's all kinds of possible groups that you're working with to support some type of supported or served agency. Well, how do you communicate? A lot of possibilities within the amateur arena. You've got all of the amateur frequencies from the bottom of the HF band up through the 440 UHF and higher. We do some emergency communications on 5.9 gigahertz microwave channels. So any amateur frequency is a potential use. Any mode that you can use in amateur radio is a potential mode to use, including analog voice, AM, FM, sideband, digital, including DMR, D-Star, Yaesu System Fusion, P25. There are all of these different types of digital modes that different organizations are using. And non-voice, including WinLink and VARA for sending like email to specific people, FL-Digi, which is a one-to-many broadcast service. Anybody that's monitoring that frequency with the right computer software can receive an FL-Digi message when it's sent out. Some organizations rely heavily on APRS, not only for location data, but for quick messaging. And don't forget, CW exists and can still be useful in many emergency situations. You might also use non-amateur modes, including personal radio services, GMRS, FRS, MERS, Citizens Band. All of those are governed under what's known as Part 95 of the FCC regulations. GMRS is licensed. You have to have a license to use it. The other parts of the personal radio services are what are called licensed by rule. There's still technical requirements and equipment requirements and operating requirements you have to comply with under the license by rule. They're not totally unlicensed, free to use forever. Commercial and business industrial radios under Part 90 of the FCC rules might be used by many organizations. Any business that's organizing an emergency response team would probably use these. Public safety radios, in any part of the spectrum, trunked or non-trunked, might be used for emergency response. Those are also regulated under Part 90. Marine might have emergency response regulated under Part 80 of the FCC rules. Now, what are all these parts about? Each specific radio service, whether it's personal radio service, amateur radio service, commercial, business, public safety, marine, all have a specific chapter, if you will, of the FCC rules that applies to those communications, to those radios, to those licenses. They each stand separate and alone. Nothing in any one part applies to any other part. So amateur radio rules apply to amateur radio communications, public safety rules apply to public safety communications, and so forth. Keep that in mind. You can't take just any radio and put it on your company's frequency or on GMRS or MERS or CB. It has to be a radio that's approved for that service and for that use. And we might use non-radio capabilities. POTS, plain old telephone service. PBX, private branch exchange phone system within a business. And fax, yep, they are still used primarily in hospitals and dispensaries and medicine producing, pharmacies to use faxes to get information from hospitals and doctors. So you might be using any of those in your emergency communications capabilities. Knowing how to work the radio that you're being asked to use is important. If you're serving a served agency like Seattle ACS served the Seattle EOC, there's an 800 megahertz trunk radio in our radio room. We're going to be expected to operate that and know how to use it. There are other radios from other services around the city of Seattle and the state of Washington. We're expected to use those. And there's amateur radio communications. So our communications commitment and obligations go beyond just amateur radio. So some basic questions. What radio should I buy? You need to put that into the context of the information we just reviewed. If you're going to be working with a team, providing communications with or for that team, then you need a radio that's compatible with whatever they're doing and whatever served agency you're providing the communications to. It may well be an amateur radio, in which case the recommendation would be to get something comparable to what other members of your team are using. If most of the people in your group have brand X, model Y of a radio, if you get brand X, model Y of a radio, you're interchangeable with them. You need a battery, they can hand you a battery. They need a speaker mic, you can hand them the speaker mic. Whatever, interchangeability, plus you got the technical knowledge in the other people. How do I do this with my radio? Oh, push that button, turn that knob, that'll get you there. This menu function, whatever. and already written code plugs, computer programs of the frequencies that you can load into your radios. So having a compatible radio really makes a lot of sense if you haven't yet bought a radio. Handheld versus mobile versus base radios. There's pros and cons to each of these. Handheld radios, they're small, they're easily carried, they're self-contained, they have very low power consumption. They don't draw a lot of power. However, handheld radios have very poor antennas, very limited battery capacity, and much shorter range than other radios. There's a trade-off to using a handheld. Mobile radios have higher transmitter power. They use an external antenna, which is in every case going to be better than the antenna on your handheld radio. And they use some sort of external power. So you might have almost unlimited power in a vehicle as long as you can still charge the battery in the vehicle, or if you're using a power supply off commercial mains power or off a generator, your mobile radio is going to have much longer use cycle. Now, if you're totally independent out in the field without a vehicle and you're just carrying your batteries with you, a mobile radio may not be the best choice because it draws a lot more power than a handheld. The cons of mobile radio, higher power consumption that I just mentioned. In a way, it's a con that it requires an external antenna and an external power source because it makes it much less portable. If you are going to carry it someplace, you're carrying a lot more equipment to be able to use that portable radio instead of mobile radio instead of a handheld radio. Let's look at base radios. And this is something you're going to primarily see in amateur radio when you get into the HF bands, but there are some very sophisticated base radio stations that have potentially much higher transmitter power. You can go into 500 to 1,000 to even 1.5 kilowatts of power, and using an external antenna that's pretty much custom installed for that radio. The radios themselves have very sophisticated capabilities, but they're large, they are not transportable, they're almost non-movable, and they can be very expensive to acquire. So what radio should you buy? Depends on how you expect to use it and where you expect to use it. That's going to make a big determination in buying a radio. I mentioned DC power considerations. I took a handheld radio I own and a mobile radio I own, and I measured the power draw into those radios. The handheld turned off had no power draw, turned on but not in use, no receiver transmit, drew 0.02 amps of power, very low power. Receiving, it drew 0.2 amps of power, and transmitting on high power, about 5 watts, it drew 1.5 amps of power. The mobile radio, turned off, drew 0.02 amps of power, turned on and idle, drew 0.58 amps of power, receiving drew 0.7 amps of power, and transmitting on high power drew 7.5 amps of power. So there you see, just by measurements, the mobile radio is going to use a lot more power. It's going to draw more power. You need more battery, more capability to provide the power with the mobile radio. Note with both the handheld and the mobile, some handhelds draw a little bit of power while they're off. If you have that type of radio, you need to disconnect the battery while the radio is in storage. Otherwise, it'll be dead when you go to use it. And mobile radios, almost all of them, draw some small amount of power when they're turned off. So if you're putting your car in infrequent use, cold weather, things like that, you might want to pull the fuse or disconnect the power cable to the mobile radio so you don't draw your vehicle battery down. How do you connect your radio to power? Use whatever your group uses for standardized power connectors. Very common in the amateur radio community are Anderson power poles that you see in these illustrations. But if your group uses something else, you should standardize on what they use. That way you can plug your radio into somebody else's battery and vice versa. What makes the biggest difference in good communications range? The antenna. It's all about the antenna. Okay, this is a little ridiculous maybe, but it's not when you get into the details. The picture on the left shows a high quality mobile or base antenna, ground plane antenna, omnidirectional antenna on a 10-foot mast and a little below that is a UHF Yagi. The Santa can just happen to be a convenient place to strap the pipe to that's holding the antennas. This is a portable setup that was set up for a public service event near Mount Rainier, which is in the background, and it worked very well. Where I had to communicate for that event, even a mag mount or permanent mount on a car would not have been sufficient. The bigger antenna made all the difference in the world. The picture on the right, the only good thing I can say about that porcupine is that an antenna outside the car outperforms an antenna inside the car. So if you've got a handheld radio, use an outside antenna. However, if you've got multiple radios in your vehicle, there's a reasonable limit as to how many you can support, and this is past that reasonable limit. As soon as he transmits on any radio, every radio in his vehicle is going to be unusable simply because the antennas are all way too close together. Use the best antenna possible. If you've got a handheld and the only antenna you've got is the antenna on the handheld, you want to hold that radio without a speaker mic in front of your face with the antenna pointing straight up and down. If you've got a speaker mic, hold the radio over your head. Get the antenna as high as you can get it. You're going to talk twice as far with the radio over your head as you are with the radio in front of your face. And you're going to talk farther with the radio in front of your face than you will with the radio on a belt or on a pack. Mobile, use an outside antenna always, even with a handheld radio. That's going to work. The car is a big metal cage around your radio, and it's going to block signals. Height is might. With a higher antenna, you've got better range, always. You see in the picture on the left, that doesn't use an outside antenna, but he's at least mounted the radio where the antenna is up by the windows instead of down surrounded by metal. Better communication than if it was laying on the seat or in a cup holder or something like that. Yagi directional antennas focus the signal in one direction, but they also block signals from other directions. So it can be effective to get you better range in one direction, but it can also be very effective to reduce reflected signals, what causes multipath. So keep a Yagi antenna available for when you need it. Keep antennas separated. There's a thing called desense. When I transmit with one radio and you're trying to listen on another radio through a repeater where they're not on the same frequency at the moment, your one radio is going to desensitize the receiver in the other radio when it's nearby that radio. And that can be within 15 or 20 feet with handhelds. It can be several car lengths with mobile radios that you need to be away from each other to avoid that desense. And that's why that car with all the antennas on it, all it's going to do is desense every radio in the car when any radio is transmitting. If you've got a chest pack like shown on the right on this picture, they're convenient for holding the radio, but they have disadvantages also. In this case, your body is a radio shield. The closer the antenna is to your body, whether it be on your belt or in a chest pack like this, your radio is not going to communicate effectively in the direction to your rear. You need to face who you're talking to so your body's not blocking the signal. The other problem with this particular chest pack is the antenna is not up and down. It's at an angle. Every degree it's off of vertical is some amount of attenuation of the signal. 90 degrees off, if that was pointing straight left and right, would be significant decrease in the transmit and receive capabilities of that antenna. So if you're within close range of everybody and the signal is not a problem, a pack like that can be very handy. If you're in a difficult communication situation, holding the radio up, getting it away from your body is going to work much better. Training. What training do you need? Well, first of all, whatever your group or served agency requires. Whatever the served agency requires, if it's a government agency, almost without exception, it's going to require some basic ICS, Incident Command System classes. 100, 200, and 700 are almost guaranteed to be required. They are online classes you can take from FEMA. They're not difficult. They give you a basic understanding of what the Incident Command System and the National Incident Management System is about. and they satisfy the requirement. Training about teamwork. Know your team, work with your team, train with your team, because that's going to make you a lot more efficient. How to do effective voice communications. It's really important that you're able to communicate brief, concise, accurate communications. Ham radio operators love to talk. They can get on the air and talk for 5 or 10 minutes and say almost nothing. On the other hand, EmComm requires you to communicate a very precise message in the shortest time possible without error. So you have to practice that. If you are communicating anything difficult, a difficult word that's not understandable, you might have to spell it. You use a phonetic alphabet to spell it. There are 2 phonetic alphabets you're liable to encounter. The first is the ITU, or International Phonetic Alphabet, which is what amateurs use. The other is law enforcement phonetic alphabet, and they are different. You need to use whatever alphabet is compatible with who you're communicating with. If I'm using my amateur radio and spelling something, I'm going to use the ITU phonetic alphabet. If I'm using the 800 megahertz radio in the EOC and need to spell something, I'm talking to a law enforcement entity or something like that, I need to use the law enforcement phonetic alphabet. I'll have them both printed out in front of me. The ITU is Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and so forth. The law enforcement is Adam, Boy, Charles, David, things like that. In both cases, they're standard words that are easily understandable to spell something. But if you're listening, you're expecting to hear the correct phonetic alphabet from the other side. If you use made up words to try to spell something, I'm not going to be used to that. That's not what I'm used to hearing or expecting to hear, and it's going to confuse the message instead of make it simpler. So use the correct phonetic alphabet. Voice communications are critical, training on it. Safety is critical. You should have training and briefings on every operation, what the safety rules are and what safe practices are. If somebody gets hurt or equipment gets damaged, you're not going to be able to do your mission. That's our number one priority, safety. What personal and radio equipment you need, Go Kit requirements. We'll talk a little more about Go Kits in a minute. What frequencies, what radio frequencies are we going to use? There's an ICS 217, which is a list of radio frequency resources, what could be used, what's available to be used. And there's an ICS 205, which is a list of specific frequencies for that function, that mission, that whatever you're doing. The ICS 205 is the actual frequencies you'll be using and what they're going to be used for. Ideally, everything on the 205 will have come off the 217. So if you have an ICS 217, those would be all of the potential frequencies your team might use. They're already pre-programmed in your radio, so when the ICS 205 is produced, you just turn the channel to whichever channel you've programmed that frequency to. What digital modes of operation are you going to be using? They require training. FLDigi and WinLink do require some training, do require some practice, and if you don't use them for a while, you need to kind of refresh. It is not easy to, on the spot, make that work if you haven't done it for 6 months or a year. So use them routinely, practice with them routinely, get training on them as needed. Sources of training. Well, there's a lot. The ARRL has a good online set of classes. They have a good basic emergency communications class. If you haven't had one, I would recommend that, unless your local organization has their own class that they prefer. FEMA has, the Office of Emergency Communications, OEC, has a class they called AUXCOM, the Auxiliary Communicator. That's a very hard class to get because they're very seldom held. It takes certified FEMA instructors who have to travel to your location. It's 3 or 4 days of in-person training. But if you can get into an AUXCOM class, it's worth doing. There's something called the Oregon ACES classes. And that's something in Washington and Oregon that we use quite frequently. They have recently revised their curriculum so it can be done virtually. And they've taught at least one virtual class. So that might be something that's available and you can pursue. And your specific group should have its own training that they offer to you. You need a way to track your training. Something we have in our Seattle ACS is an online task book that you can go in and check off what tasks. If you click the task, it's a link to more information about it. When you've satisfied that requirement, you put a check mark in, and then leadership, someone in ACS leadership is going to review what you've done and check off that you've completed it. This entire thing can be done manually too. You don't need a genius who builds this system for you that we have. Do it on paper, but you need a way to identify what training tasks you want and how to track when you've satisfied and completed them. So that's part of what your organization should do. Okay, Go Kits. Do you need a Go Kit? Absolutely, you need one. What should be in it? What you need. Now, that's a pretty generic answer. You need a Go Kit that's going to serve you. You probably need two Go Kits. You need a radio Go Kit and you need a personal Go Kit. And you can put them all together into a single backpack like this guy's done. But that probably is going to need to be a slightly bit smaller. Your radio Go Kit should allow you to operate on whatever you're going to do, whatever frequencies you need to use, whatever modes of operation are being specified for the duration of your deployment. If you're being asked to go out on a 24-hour deployment, you need to have 24 hours worth of battery. You need to have 24 hours worth of radio. And if you go out with a handheld radio with one battery, that's going to run out before you complete that mission. So your radio Go Kit has to have enough stuff in it to meet the requirements of the mission. Your personal Go Kit has to keep you sustained for that same duration. You're on your own. You should be expected to show up wherever you're being assigned with everything you need to last for however long that's going to take. Food, water, clothing, medicine, shelter, everything you need needs to be in your personal Go Kit. A lot of organizations suggest you have a couple of Go Kits, maybe a 24-hour kit and maybe a 72-hour kit. When they call you up and say hit the road, you grab the kit that's applicable to the expected duration of your assignment. There are a ton of Go Kit lists online. You can track down a variety. This is one I found in just a few minutes doing an online search. They have a 2-hour carry kit and a 12-hour Go Kit in this example. And clearly the 2-hour carry kit is a very small list. The 12-hour is somewhat longer, and if you were to go to a 24 or 72-hour kit, it's going to continue to grow. What you need to do is take what your organization requirements are and what your personal requirements are and create your list that has what you are going to need based on what you have available to put into that kit. Make up a list, laminate it, and put it in your Go Kit backpack or whatever. When it's time to deploy, take that list out and make sure that everything that's on it is in that pack, is in that go bag before you walk out the door. Without a list, you are going to forget something. What about your family? What about your house? Don't expect to dash off to save the world until you know they're taken care of. And that means you got to have some personal and family preparation built into your emergency communications response. Have supplies at home. A recent example, Texas in the winter storm. People were scrambling for water. They didn't have power. Nobody was able to sustain themselves for any period of time without some outside resource. Well, in a disaster or an emergency response, you may not have that outside resource showing up as fast as they did in Texas. Look at Gulf Coast hurricanes. They know they're coming. What happens to local stores? People clean the shelves off before the hurricane gets there. Well, there's a lot of places you don't get advanced warnings. The Pacific Northwest has earthquake risk. That's the big one that we prepare for. We don't get an advanced warning, so you got to have all that stuff in advance before the earthquake, or you're going to be stuck when it happens. So have a personal family preparedness, have supplies on hand for the family, food, water, etc., to sustain them. The recommendation is for 2 weeks. Then when you leave, you know that they're going to be okay until you get back. There's a big difference between being prepared for Armageddon. I'm not telling you to all become preppers. Be prepared for the hazards that you reasonably expect. If you're in tornado country, the recovery is going to, the devastation is going to be it's going to be a path through the town, not everybody in town. If you're in earthquake country, it could be the whole city destroyed. And if you're in the hurricane country, it could be the whole community destroyed. So prepare for whatever the hazards that you expect to face, and you're going to be better a responder when the time comes to respond. In Washington, we have something called Map Your Neighborhood. You can get information on it from the Washington State Emergency Management website, from most county websites. It's a real good program on how to prepare your family and your house for disasters and emergencies, and also to work with your neighbors to have preparation at the neighborhood level, at the block level, for response to disasters and emergencies. I imagine most states have comparable programs. You just need to look online, see what they are, and then take advantage of those programs to prepare for your family. Not so basic question. Nobody thinks about this, but it's probably one of the most important. How do you interact with your served agency? If you're working in an EOC, you need to blend right in with whoever else is there. You need to be part of that operating team. Don't come running in with your handheld radio and the attitude that you're going to save the world with your ham radio communications, because you're going to get a pretty chilly reception. Come in with, I'm here to help. What can I do? What do I need to do? If you've trained with your team, you'll have most of those answers already. You will work with the people that are in that EOC already. And when the activation comes where they really need you, you're going to know what to do and how to do it. Apparel, behavior, training, knowledge, compliance with their policies and practices all matter. It can happen. It does happen. It isn't easy. It takes time to develop those relationships, but the end result is really good. Here's a picture from an activation of the Seattle Emergency Operations Center. In this picture is the Deputy Chief of Police, the Mayor, the Director of Emergency Management, 2 volunteers, and several city employees. And they are all working together just like that's all there was. And they've done it before. They're used to working with each other. Each one knows the role that they have to play and what they have to do in order to make this operation a success. And that's how you can serve an agency. You need that training, you need that practice, you need those relationships to be really effective. And that happens over time on a recurring basis. For the really, really new person, in our in-person Comm Academy classes, we had a beginner's track, and I would estimate that half the people in the beginner's track had never pushed to talk on their radio. They had never actually transmitted on their radios. They had a license, they had a radio, yet to be used. You know what? Hams love to help people make that first contact. Don't be bashful. Push to talk. Start using your radio. Find somebody nearby. Go on a local repeater and say, hi, this is N7KUW. I just got my license. Anybody want to talk to me? You'll get a lot of responses. People love to help the new guy along. Don't be afraid to ask your team or whoever you're working with to work with you to help you get experience using your radio. Know how to use it before you have to use it. Otherwise, again, you're not going to be as effective as you need to be. Done properly, you'll grow as a team and you'll get the training and experience you need to function when the time comes. Take everything at a reasonable pace. You don't have to go overboard. There is such a thing as too much. I think this is the inside of the car we saw all of the antennas on way back in the beginning of the class. I wouldn't even get in that vehicle, let alone drive it someplace or ride in it. It's useless. But, if you do things in a methodical basis and learn and train and work as a team, before you know it, you're going to be an old hand at things and you're going to be helping the next new guy along. Ask, work with people. That pretty much summarizes the basic orientation that I've put together. You're welcome to contact me personally anytime if you have questions. Email address c.leon@m7kuw.com will work. And Right after this session, there will be a question and answer period. I'll be available for that, as will some other people. So if you've got questions coming out of this, please stay tuned. Don't go away. We'll go right into that question and answer period. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.